welcome back to the Storied Life. This is session 7. I'm your host, Bob Osborne. Do you know any good storytellers? My dad was a pretty good one. He was an itinerant preacher back when that was a thing, which meant he spoke in different places. And when we were with him, we would hear him tell his stories over and over, which trained me in something. I learned to enjoy a good telling of a story, noticing when a story I knew was told particularly well. Sometimes Dad would miss something or tell something in a different way, and I would notice that. And other times he would just hit all the high points, just do it well. And I would really enjoy those times. I guess you could say I had my dad's stories memorized. Memory, it turns out, is absolutely vital to story and the storied life. So here's a story about memory. A couple are getting on in life. They are both having problems remembering things. So they go to their doctor and he tells them, physically, you're fine. Just learn to write things down. So that night, while watching TV, the old man gets up and says, do you want anything from the kitchen? And she says, will you get me a bowl of ice cream? And he says, sure. And she says, don't you think you should write it down so you can remember it? He says, no, I can remember it. And so she adds, well, I'd like some strawberries on top too. Maybe you should write it down. He says, no, you want a bowl of ice cream with strawberries. I got it. And then she says, and I'd also like some whipped cream. I'm certain you'll forget this. Please write it down, she says. And he gets really irritated. I don't need to write it down. I can remember it. Ice cream with strawberries and whipped cream. I got it. So he toddles off into the kitchen. And about 20 minutes later, he returns from the kitchen and he hands his wife a plate of bacon and eggs. And she stares at the plate for a moment. And then she says, I knew you'd forget the toast. Okay, now how does that story work? Through memory, right? I mean your memory, you the listener. It works because you remembered the appropriate details. Today I'm suggesting that memory is vital to the storied life. It's vital to understanding the meaning of your own story. So what are you meant to remember? I think it's likely you've had the experience of reading a novel or watching a movie only to find you no longer know what is going on. You've lost the thread of meaning, either through inattention or forgetfulness. The story is simply lost to you. So I'm watching a movie with Susan and I realize I'm lost. So I ask her, now who is that guy? And she says, that's so-and-so connected to so-and-so. And I say, oh, okay. And then she says, anyway, you fell asleep. I heard you snore. So if we don't pay attention, or if we forget critical details, it's just hard to follow the story. In this session, we're focusing on the importance of memory in living the storied life. So here's the principle. We remember in order to understand. What would happen if we all forgot together what we needed to remember together? What happens if we live in a system of collective forgetfulness? Would we be able to understand anything at all? So here's the novel 1984 by George Orwell, still one of the most penetrating looks into how collective amnesia or collective forgetfulness can become a system. So Winston Smith is a clerk in the Ministry of Truth, and his job is to alter newspapers and other things. And everything must line up with Big Brother and the party. And when Winston edits something or updates it to a newer version, he simply drops the old version down the memory hole. It's a system of forgetfulness. There's a line quoted several times through the novel, and it's this: who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Now, that's one of those quotes worth pondering, and maybe it's time to reread 1984. Most of you are familiar with the Peter Pan story. It was originally a play by J.M. Barrie with this title, Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Would Not Grow Up. Barrie actually said that the horror of growing up was the root idea of Peter Pan. So there's a guy with issues. But apparently, Barrie's brother died when he was just a young boy, and his mother reacted by saying, well, at least he never had to grow up. And that seemed to stick with Barrie growing up, because growing up was the enemy. It was to be avoided. So in the novel, Peter distrusts mothers because mothers turn children into adults. Keep back, lady, he yells at Mrs. Darling. No one is going to catch me and make me a man. So for Barrie then, youth is carefree fun, and adulthood is difficulties and burdens and losses. At one point in the story, Peter describes himself as a lost boy, someone who doesn't know where he comes from. He describes himself to Wendy as someone who doesn't know any stories. You see, I don't know any stories. None of the lost boys know any stories. And Wendy responds, how perfectly awful. In the fall of 2016, I was sensing that a change was coming in my life. Things had shifted around me significantly. And I decided to take a trip. I wanted to go back to St. John's Abbey in Collegeville, Minnesota, a fantastic place for prayer and silence. And I've been there several times. And I also wanted to visit Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska, as I was considering a program there in spiritual direction, which I have now completed. So I flew into Minneapolis. I rented a car, and I took the day to drive from Minneapolis to Omaha, not too far, 6 hours. It was a beautiful fall day. And as I was driving, I had a memory. I recalled something that had happened to me when I was 17. Now, it's hard to describe this. I'm very reticent to talk about something that not everyone understands, but I had a life-changing experience in my bedroom, an encounter that changed my life. It was real, it was beautiful, and it was genuine, and I was never the same afterwards. Now listen, I was a typical 17-year-old. My life was basketball. But that night in my bedroom, I encountered the mysterious more of existence, God. The reason I tell you this is that I remembered it when I was driving from Minneapolis to Omaha that day. It just all flooded back to me. I hadn't forgotten it, but I hadn't actively remembered it. And I said that day, I was 17, it was the fall, and now I'm 57 and it's the fall. It's been 40 years since that happened. And this passage from Deuteronomy 8 came back to me. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years. On that drive, I was putting my story back together, bringing into that moment a piece of my life I should never forget. And I realized something. I needed to do better in remembering my life. Remember how the Lord God has led you. So I picked up a notebook on that trip and I began to collect my stories. And maybe that's when this series began, because since that time and over these past few years, I am regularly given memories. They just come back to me. Well, in one way, they come back to me. And in another way, I am now looking for them. The story I just told you about driving and remembering my life came at an opportune moment. Over the following year and a bit, I was about to enter a time of real dislocation and deep disappointment. And I have learned how important the gift of memory really is. I'd like to recall a little Jesus story, not often told. It's found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 8. It's just a little piece that follows on the heels of one of the highlights in the life of Jesus. The highlight is the miraculous feeding of a huge crowd. So think about it. Jesus takes just a little bit of food, because that's all there was, only enough to feed a few, and he multiplies that small amount to feed thousands. It's extraordinary. It's absolutely wondrous. And that's how the crowd sees it, as a marvel that meant something. There are actually two of these miraculous feedings in Mark's gospel. In chapter 6, where Jesus feeds 5,000, and then in the context we're going to look at in chapter 8, where he feeds 4,000. And these were amazing moments, but they were also highly symbolic, because each time these feedings happen, they are in a remote place, a wilderness. And the crowds who hear Jesus teach and multiply the bread know their history. They knew that Moses had fed the people thousands of years previously with the mysterious bread, the manna, the bread that comes from heaven. And he did that in the wilderness. And there's even more. Moses had actually foretold that one day God would raise up someone like himself. A prophet like me were his actual words. So with all that background in their corporate memory, we could say, when Jesus feeds the crowds in those deserted spots, they get a little excited. They were wondering if they should make him king. But Jesus resisted all that, as the story is told, because although he was the king, he had another path to travel. We're going to talk about that in a future time. There were those, however, who didn't like what he was doing. At the end of the second feeding, the second miracle, some people called Pharisees stepped forward and they asked Jesus for a sign, specifically a sign from heaven. Now, I'm not completely sure what they mean by that. Something bigger and better, maybe? Which shows us again that it's possible to miss the meaning moments in life because we are always looking for something other than what God gives. So we have to be careful we don't miss the meanings in what is already there in front of us. Jesus leaves with his disciples. They get into a boat and they cross to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's right here that something happens in the story that I want to take note of. It will underline the principle I have already mentioned. We remember in order to understand. So here's the text. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And they discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. So apparently, still remembering his conversation with the Pharisees back across the lake, Jesus says something in his usually cryptic way. Watch out for, well, whatever permeates the souls of those guys. That's what yeast does, doesn't it? It's invisible, but it takes over. He's using a metaphor, for sure he is. But as we see here, his disciples don't get it. So we end up then with a kind of comedic moment, don't we? Because when Jesus says this, the disciples reply, well, they're thinking, yeast? What's he talking about? Oh, we forgot the bread. Peter, I told you to bring some of the leftovers. And as we read the stories of Jesus over and over, we see how constantly the disciples are lagging behind him. Do you feel that about yourself sometimes? I often do. I'm always catching up to the meaning. And that might be our human condition. So here's the text again. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? Jesus is quite aware they didn't understand his statement about the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. So he adjusts. He asks a few questions. And if you read the Gospels, Jesus asks a lot of questions, hundreds of them, and here are a few more. Don't you understand? Well, do we understand? Are your hearts hard? Now, that's an interesting question because we usually think we miss meaning because something is intellectually challenging, but maybe we miss some meanings because we're resistant to them, like having a hard heart. And then Jesus says this, maybe you don't understand because you just keep forgetting the story. So he decides to rehearse the story of the bread with his friends. And here's the text. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? What do you think he means them to get here? Maybe it's just so simple that if he is with them, they have all they need. If they put all the details together, they would see that that was the piece that always was there. Jesus was there. So to remember is to put the story back together. To remember is to understand. A member is a piece, a part, right? To remember is to put those parts back together. To dismember is to allow all the pieces of life and experience to exist in separate places where nothing connects. You will always miss the meaning if you fail to hold together all the pieces of the story. So let me say it this way. There are pieces of your story you cannot afford to forget. And now we will take a little time to reflect on what we have heard in these stories. The first question is very practical. What helps you catch a memory? We all know how something can trigger a memory in us. So what triggers your memories? A song can do that. Many people say a smell can trigger a memory. Or an artifact of some kind. Before she passed away, my mother gave me the cookie jar we had in the house when I was just a kid. I was just looking at that the other day, and it brought back a world that had all but disappeared for me. There's a certain area of our city that causes me a lot of pain if I just drive into it, and you might know a similar reality. Number 2, I told you my story of the long drive several years ago and how I began to collect my memories. How might you go about collecting your memories? According to the text in Deuteronomy 8, what is the purpose of remembering? Now, I didn't say much about healing painful memories, but that is a real thing. Sometimes we don't want to remember because it hurts. So let me say then that some of us need to be healed of painful memories. And this talk may simply remind you there is something buried in you that needs some healing, some light and love. So it's time. Now here is a really important question. Are there a few moments or even one moment from your life that you must always remember, that you must never forget? What would you fail to understand about your own story if you forgot that specific thing or those things? And then finally, number 4, you probably know how we can learn to look at past memories differently as time passes, as we gain new perspective. So the principle I gave in the talk is relevant here. We remember in order to understand. Maybe you could ponder this with a friend. One last thought. A few years ago, I discovered how sleep, good old ordinary sleep, impacts memory. Sleep provides the context for something called memory consolidation. When we sleep, we sort through the various pieces of information from that day. We let go of the inconsequential, we could say, the trivial, the small things, maybe what we picked up from the grocery store on the way home, for instance. We let go of those small things in order to hold in memory the pieces of our story that seem to really matter, maybe the interesting person we met that day. And that is why when we have something really big happen, either something incredibly wonderful or deeply troubling, our sleep is affected because we're trying to incorporate some new significant piece into our storied life. It seems then that rest is important to our ability to remember our life well. I hope you are able to take the breaks you need, the stops, the rests, so that you can better remember your storied life. Bye for now.